Hello and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. This episode of Horns is really a powerhouse of intelligence knowledge. We're listening to an interview between Admiral William McRaven and John Brennan, former Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, about Brennan's book, Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. McRaven, of course, through his extensive career in the special operations community, interacted frequently with the intelligence community. McRaven and Brennan are introduced by yet another intelligence powerhouse. Stephen Slick of the Intelligence Studies Project at the University of Texas, Austin, served 28 years in the CIA's clandestine service, including 5 assignments abroad. Between 2005 and 2009, he was a special assistant to the president and the senior director for intelligence programs and reform on the staff of the National Security Council. Overall, this is a discussion that is wide-ranging in terms of the history of the CIA, the decision-making styles of the presidents for whom Brennan worked, as well as touching in detail both on the events of 9/11 and some of the more controversial programs with which the CIA was involved. Let's listen in.
Now, we're honored today to welcome 2 distinguished Longhorns for a book talk and national security conversation centered on John Brennan's new book, Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. Director Brennan is an alumnus, an advisor to the ISP, and also a distinguished fellow here at the university. He renewed his association with UT Austin several years ago after 33 years of government service. And as you likely know, John served as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency under President Barack Obama from 2013 to 2017. Before he became CIA director, John served in the White House for 4 years as the assistant to President Obama for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. He began his service in government at the CIA, where he worked from 1980 to 2005. John spent most of his early career in the agency's main analytic arm, the Directorate of Analysis, then, of course, was known as the Directorate of Intelligence, specializing in the Near East and South Asia, before he was put in charge of counterterrorism analysis in the early 1990s. Now, in 1994-1995, John was the daily intelligence briefer for President Bill Clinton. He then completed an assignment overseas as a chief of station in the Middle East and returned to serve as chief of staff to the director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet. John was the deputy executive director at the CIA in 2003 when he was asked by Director Tenet to stand up a new organization that we all watched grow into the National Counterterrorism Center. John became NCTC's interim director the following year. Now, Director Brennan will be joined in conversation today by his friend and our colleague, Admiral William McRaven. The Admiral doesn't need much of an introduction here at the University of Texas, but I'll give him a short one anyway. He's also a UT alumnus and the last chancellor of the University of Texas system. Admiral McRaven assumed a professorship at the LBJ School of Public Affairs in 2018. As UT's chancellor, Admiral McRaven oversaw 14 institutions that educate 221,000 students and employ 20,000 faculty and more than 80,000 healthcare professionals, researchers, and staff. As the commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command, Admiral McRaven led a force of 69,000 men and women and was responsible for conducting counterterrorism operations worldwide. As you know, Admiral McRaven oversaw the 2011 Navy SEAL raid in Pakistan that killed al-Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden. Admiral McRaven is also an accomplished author. His books include a textbook, Spec Ops, Case Studies in Special Operations, the iconic Make Your Bed, and last year's terrific memoir, Sea Stories, My Life in Special Operations. Admiral McRaven knows a few things about intelligence as well. 2016, he received the Richard Helms Award from the CIA's Officers Memorial Foundation. So with that, I'm going to turn off my video, mute my microphone, and turn the event over to you, Admiral McRaven.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's great to be here. And let me thank you and the Intelligence Studies Project for hosting this event. I will tell you, I'm personally honored to have the opportunity to interview John Brennan. As you mentioned, an old dear friend, and he and I have worked together quite a bit over the last 20 years. And this is really, as you said, about his new book, Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. Now, let me tell you something. If you haven't read this book, pick it up. It's magnificent. It is funny. It is self-effacing. It's exciting. It's insightful. It's thoughtful. and candidly, one of the best books I've read in terms of understanding what goes on inside the halls of the CIA, the White House, and frankly, the broader intelligence community. So just a fabulous book. So welcome, John. Let me start there. Good to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you for doing this. And I want to also thank Steve and the Intelligence Studies Project, University of Texas. It is great to always interact with my fellow Longhorns. I miss being down in Austin. Having been down there, I started in Austin back in the late 70s, but it's always enjoyable to talk with students and staff, and especially to engage with you, Bill, except for your proclivity to engage in hyperbole when you're talking about books written by your friends and former colleagues. I really respect everything that you say.
Thanks, John. But in all seriousness, fabulous book. I mean, I have marked it up, gone through it. I learned a lot of things that even with all my time with the agency, I didn't really completely understand until I had a chance to read it. So, you start the book, your first chapter is on your last or second last day as the CIA director on January 6th, 2017. But I want to hold off for just a minute before we get into the discussion on that. It is a great way to start the book, and then, of course, you kind of bookend it at the end. But I really think it's important for the audience to understand, how your upbringing had an impact on you. You were raised in Hudson County, New Jersey. You had these two remarkable parents, Owen and Dottie, and frankly, your broader family. And they all really seem to have, again, an effect on your approach to life and how you dealt with difficult decisions when you were in all these various leadership positions. So let's kind of start with that if we can.
Well, thanks, Bill. We're all products of our experiences and our upbringings. And I knew that my upbringing was very important as far as shaping who I became ultimately. But when I started to do the research for my memoir and went back into my old hometown back in Hudson County and talked with people, I realized just how profound those early years were in terms of shaping who I ultimately became. I was born into a very loving family, as you mentioned, Owen and Dottie. Owen was an immigrant from Ireland. He emigrated from Ireland in 1948 when he was 28 years old. And he always impressed upon my brother, sister, and me just how special it was to be an American citizen. He said he had to strive for 28 years in order to get to this great land of opportunity. And he told us never to take it for granted. And he told us that frequently as those who are born here, we don't realize just how special it is and always be thinking about giving back to our country, our community. So that sense of public service, I think, was instilled in me early on. But also, we grew up in a household where we had a very strong faith in terms of our Catholic faith that we were raised in. And it wasn't just the doctrine of Catholicism. It was trying to make sure that we understood the difference between right and wrong and having a moral compass that was going to guide us in our life. And things like honesty and truthfulness and integrity. And those lessons at home from my parents were reinforced in my school by teachers and also by coaches, because I played a lot of sports when I was younger. And so just, again, thinking back on it, and I try to talk a little bit about it in the memoir, just how it really formative it was as far as how I thought about myself, how I thought about my interactions with others, and how I wanted to, live my life ultimately. And so when I look back on that time, I had very, very fond memories of family, large, an extended Irish Catholic family with cousins and uncles and aunts. And it was a real sense of belonging that I really cherished. And I think I benefited from greatly over the course of my life.
And I noticed throughout the course of the book, you come back frequently to those times, to those upbringings. You talk just remarkably well about your father and your mother, and again, kind of touching, heartwarming, but also, to your point, a great foundation, a great moral compass for moving forward. So in 1973, you head off to Fordham University for your undergraduate school. You spend some time in Egypt, in the Middle East, as part of your kind of semester abroad. You graduate, you come down here to UT to get a master's, and then you think about a career in the CIA. So what was it about the CIA that kind of inspired you to join the intelligence community? And can you tell the listeners about kind of what that process was like? Because I know there are probably a lot of young men and women out there that are thinking about joining the agency, but I think they'd like to understand How do you get into it? How tough is that acceptance process?
Well, as you pointed out, I had the great opportunity to spend some time overseas during my college years. During the summer of my freshman year, I went over to Indonesia. My cousin was serving as the Food for Peace officer at the embassy in Jakarta for the Agency for International Development. And so he invited me to come over to Indonesia. And so I spent the summer over there and traveled around Java, went over to Bali, and I did a paper on oil and politics in Indonesia. And at 18 years old, it really did open my eyes to the world. Until then, I basically spent my entire life in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. But when I went overseas, I realized that the world is very big and very diverse. And I put America also into a broader global context, which is why I then went to Egypt in my junior year to study Arabic and also to learn about that fascinating region of the world, the Middle East. And so when I finished up my undergraduate school, I decided to go to graduate school at the University of Texas. UT had a very good government program with a concentration in Middle East studies at the time. And so I entered the doctoral program. I got married in the meantime. I was married at the tender age of 22, and Kathy and I traveled down to Texas. And although I was in the doctoral program, I was really itching to get started on my professional career. And in my senior year at Fordham, when I was commuting back and forth to Fordham, I saw in the New York Times an ad for the CIA, looking for some good young men and women to join the ranks. And so I had an interview over in New York, and the interviewer gave me an application. And so when I was down at UT, I took that application out of my files and decided to send it in. And given that I had a little bit of overseas experience and also some Arabic, it made me, I think, attractive to the CIA, particularly in the operations side, because I did have that overseas experience. So the CIA offered me the opportunity to engage in public service, give back to my country, but also an opportunity to see the world and to satisfy the wanderlust, but also the intellectual curiosity I had about who I am, the United States' role in the world. And it was an organization that, although had a controversial reputation, it was one that I felt I was going to be able to thrive within, because I was going to be among people who had really, vast experience in terms of traveling and seeing and understanding the world. And so when I applied, when I was down at UT, and CIA invited me up to Washington, D.C. to take a battery of tests, psychological, medical, and polygraph tests. I squeaked by a couple of them, and they offered me a job. And so that's when Kathy and I packed up our things in Austin, hitched our car to the back of a U-Haul, and drove up to Washington for what turned out to be just an exciting, exhilarating, and fascinating career.
Okay, so you get accepted by the CIA, and then when you come in, really there are kind of two branches within the agency. You can be an analyst or you can be a case officer. And you started off in the world of kind of case officers in the operational end, but there was something about that that you had, kind of a tough time accepting. You understood the role and the necessity of the case officer, but you had kind of back to your Catholic upbringing. There was an aspect of this that troubled you. So can you give the audience a sense of, one, what it's like to be an analyst and a case officer, and why you had to kind of struggle with this kind of understanding of the role of a case officer?
Right. CIA case officers or operations officers, they are the ones who the CIA hires and trains and then sends overseas to recruit foreign assets, foreign spies to spy on behalf of the U.S. government. And so the case officers are the ones that will go overseas, frequently under some type of commercial or other government cover, and try to cultivate relationships with individuals to try to establish a relationship that will allow those individuals then to have confidence that they can go and spy against their governments for the CIA. But when those case officers go out, they don't introduce themselves as CIA. They introduce themselves as somebody else, again, whatever their cover is going to be. And when I went through the psychological testing, when I was applying to CIA, the psychologist, when she was looking at my answers to different questions, she said, "You really don't have the psychological profile of what makes a good case officer." I was an introvert. And I wasn't really comfortable going up and just striking up conversations with people and then looking for what their vulnerabilities might be that could exploit in order to develop and cultivate a relationship that could then turn into a spying relationship. So when I joined the agency, I already had some reservations. And when I went into the agency in the operations directorate, I was exposed more to that operational environment, what a case officer would have to do. And as you pointed out, it's sometimes my Catholic guilt, prevents me from deceiving other people. I'm not a very good poker player. I think people can see it in my face. And as people may have detected over the last several years, I tend to speak out and speak my mind. And so I really couldn't see, again, developing a relationship with somebody as somebody I'm not. And so when I had the opportunity to serve an assignment in the analytics side of the CIA, I felt that type of work was much more aligned with my interests, my skills, and what I wanted to do with my career. And so I switched out from operations to analysis. And it's not all that infrequent that somebody who comes into CIA through one door, through working on one discipline or one professional path, will change their professional path once they get into the agency. In fact, CIA has 63 professional disciplines that run the gamut from operations to analysis, security, logistics, legal, science, technology, you name it. And so I knew I wanted to join the agency because of the opportunities it would offer me. But once I got in, I felt much more comfortable in those analytic ranks.
So as your career progresses, you kind of become a rising star. You do become a rising star in the CIA. And in your late 30s, I believe it was, you're chosen to be the CIA's briefer for the President's Daily Brief, the PDB. So give the audience a sense of what's it like to brief the President of the United States and the kind of the nature of the PDB.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't think I was a rising star. I think I was somebody who demonstrated I'm willing to work hard, maybe work long hours, and to take some assignments that other people maybe have shunned. And also, when you're in a place like CIA, it's being in the right place in the right time. And I had the opportunity that was offered to me to be President Clinton's daily briefer, along with Vice President Gore and some of the other senior national security officials in the White House. I jumped at the opportunity. Until then, I had only worked on the Middle East and South Asia and counterterrorism. But when you're a daily briefer for the President of the United States, you have to be able to brief on every imaginable national security topic and be ready to field questions that you might be posed to you. And so it was a rather anxiety-producing, nerve-wracking, but also a very fascinating opportunity to actually see a president and vice president of the United States national security advisor in action and see how intelligence is fed into that process, and also realize that intelligence is one stream of information and consideration that goes into that policy formulation. So as you said, at a relatively young age, I was GS-15, my late 30s, and it really just allowed me to understand how CIA's work and mission were factoring into national security decisions that were being made. And so when I started in the agency, one of the things I really wanted to do throughout my career was to be able to have as many different types of experiences as possible, because I viewed that professional journey as one that I would have a toolkit, basically, and I'd pick up all these different tools and experiences that I could then leverage later on in my career. And so having the opportunity to be President Clinton's daily briefer, and this is a time when the Balkans were flaring, as well as terrorism issues and other things, and a lot of things that were going on between the United States and Russia, it just really expanded my knowledge base, as well as appreciation for just how difficult the policymaking process is that the intelligence work feeds into.
So can you give us a sense, because you did have a chance to brief Clinton, I think during your time at TTIC, you also saw how George W. Bush kind of took in intelligence, and then obviously you spent time with President Obama. The way that the presidents, the first customers, as you talk about, receive the intelligence, can you give us some indication or some sense of how these three men kind of grappled with or consumed the intelligence?
I served for 6 presidents. I got to know 3 of them, as you pointed out very well. I also got to know George H.W. Bush, mostly after he had left government, but also it was my first visit to the Oval Office when he was the president of the United States. And this was in the early 90s. And I went down to the White House to brief on what the implications would be if the United States used its military might and a coalition to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And I must tell you, that was a very intimidating experience, because here you have a president of the United States who was former vice president and was also director of CIA. And so he had tremendous background experience that whatever we said, he could automatically put it into context and perspective. Now, when I started to be President Clinton's briefer, he had been governor of Arkansas before he went to the White House. So he didn't have that deep reservoir of national security and international affairs experience, but he was a tremendous consumer of intelligence, and his ability to absorb and process and then recall information was just the most impressive I had ever seen. His mind really worked like a computer. And I relate a story in the book when one morning I'm briefing him about what's going on in the Balkans, and a lot of those PDB, the President's Daily Brief articles, would be replete with a lot of names and other information. And President Clinton one morning pointed to a name in the PDB and said, "Isn't this the same person that you mentioned to me, about 6 or 8 weeks ago?" I had long since forgotten that name that I had mentioned to him, but sure enough, when I checked, he had it dead right. And so his ability, again, to absorb information and retain it, and then be able to use it as he was thinking through policy issues, was very, very impressive. George W. Bush was very, very intellectually curious as well, and he would read a lot. But also, he really enjoyed the back and forth with analysts, with case officers, with technologists, and CIA scientists. And frequently, there'd be groups of CIA officers that would go down to the Oval Office or down to the White House Situation Room to engage in an extended conversation with President Bush, because he really wanted to understand the details. He would get into the weeds of things. And so he was always looking for more information. I think that's a real hallmark of the presidents that I served. And so it was a combination of reading things, but then having that interaction. President Barack Obama, obviously, I got to know most well because I had served for the 8 years of his administration. The first 4, my office in the West Wing was directly below the Oval Office, and so I spent a lot of time with him. And he was somebody who, again, was a voracious reader. He would stay up well into the late night, early morning, consuming memos before our National Security Council meetings. And as you well know, Bill, he frequently would be the best read, best informed person when we would meet in the White House Situation Room. But he also was somebody who had a real knack for seeing relationships between issues. And I equated it to, he played 3-dimensional chess. And he recognized that if the United States did something on one of those chessboards, it affected our position as well as opportunities on another part of that national security, international landscape chessboard. And he could see out 2, 3, and 4 moves, and would always be asking questions about, well, what happens if we do this, we do that? And he was always had this great thirst for more information. Now, sometimes that is something that I think is very important for presidents to be asking questions. But at some point, you're never going to have complete information about something, and you have to take action. And sometimes Barack Obama was criticized for, waiting for more information. But I must say, especially in a lot of my interactions with him when I was at the White House, when he needed to make decisions, he made those decisions, recognizing that as much as the intelligence community might be able to gather and obtain and analysis and expertise we can put forward, there would always be gaps in our knowledge and our understanding. And he would have to then just make decisions based on that incomplete array of intelligence and analysis.
So while you were there as the President's Daily Briefer, you make friends with George Tenet, who was also in the White House at the time. And then eventually you become a Director Tenet's Chief of Staff. And of course, during that time, al-Qaeda terrorist strike on 9/11. So can you give the listeners a sense of what the agency went through just as 9/11 happens and then in the aftermath of 9/11?
Yeah, George Tenet was basically somebody who became a lifelong friend, colleague, mentor, big brother ever since I was one of his PV briefers when he was down at the White House. And then when he was nominated to be the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, he asked me to join him. And I served in different capacities for him, including the Chief of Staff. But on 9/11, I was the Deputy Executive Director of CIA, which is basically the Deputy Chief Operating Officer. I didn't have responsibilities for the mission, operations, analysis. My responsibility was to ensure those missions were enabled with all of the personnel, the resources, capabilities, budget, money, you name it. And so on 9/11, that morning, George Tenet was downtown. He was having lunch with the former head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Warren. And John McLaughlin, deputy, was hosting the meeting on our 7th floor. And toward the end of the meeting, the head of our situation room came in and said the plane had struck the towers. And you know what happened after that? We saw the second plane hit the tower. And we knew that we were then engaged in a real war as well as a real race against time to try to prevent al-Qaeda from carrying out follow-on attacks, which they had planned and were ready to implement, including a very deadly plan to launch a series of aircraft attacks against the west coast of the United States that we launched out of Southeast Asia. And so from the moment that those planes hit and we knew al-Qaeda was responsible, the CIA went forward and tried to, again, collect as much intelligence as possible, tried to understand what al-Qaeda had planned, tried to thwart those operations. But also, given that CIA has quite a good reputation and a deserved one for being able to respond very quickly and very, with great agility, George W. Bush tapped CIA to send people out immediately to Afghanistan. So it was CIA boots that hit the ground in Afghanistan first. It was CIA blood that was spilled first, unfortunately, when Mike Spann, a CIA officer, was killed in Afghanistan in November of 2001. But for the subsequent weeks and months and years, CIA was involved in this struggle to prevent al-Qaeda from, again, following up the 9/11 attacks with other horrific and lethal strikes against the homeland or against U.S. interests abroad. And George Tenet was leading the charge and trying to make sure that CIA did everything possible. But one of the things that I really realized at that time was just how important those international relationships are that CIA has developed over the years with partners and allies and countries, intelligence, security services around the globe. Because as good as CIA is, as good as FBI and NSA are, we really need to rely on a lot of our foreign friends and partners to carry out such a worldwide effort. And as we know, the worst controversial policies that were implemented, but CIA's mission, again, was this race against time to see what we could do to prevent follow-on attacks, because I do think CIA officers felt the degree of responsibility for not being able to stop that attack. I'm not calling it intelligence failure, but unfortunately, weren't able to understand exactly the nature and the date and the details of that 9/11 plot.
John, you talked about kind of some of the controversial tactics, and obviously the rendition, detention, and interrogation program was one of those. You were clearly never a fan of the enhanced interrogations, but unfortunately that kind of controversy followed you the rest of your career. So can you talk about the rendition, the detention, the interrogation program, and kind of the lessons learned from that and what your concerns were at the time?
Well, after the 9/11 attacks, it became quite, I think, obvious to the administration that in this all-out effort to try to uncover al-Qaeda's plans, that there would be a lot of al-Qaeda members who would be detained. And so the big question was, then what will we do with them? And how will we get intelligence from them? Well, for a variety of reasons, it was decided that the CIA would basically take the lead in this program that was a covert action program, rendition, detention, interrogation, render individuals from one country to another, detain them in CIA detention facilities abroad, and then interrogate them using what's called enhanced interrogation techniques, including things like waterboarding. And the CIA had no background or experience in ever having stood up or implemented a program like this before. But the fact that the CIA does these things covertly when a president authorizes it to do it made it, I think, the very convenient opportunity or option for the administration to seize upon. And so President Bush issued what's called a memorandum of notification, which is an addition to an existing covert action finding. And that finding and that memorandum authorized CIA to carry out this program. That program also was deemed lawful by the highest legal advisory body in the executive branch. That's the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice. That program was also briefed to the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate, and resources were allocated for it. So that detention interrogation program had all of the features necessary for a lawful covert action program that the CIA then was basically authorized and obligated to carry out. Now, what I say in the book is that when I wasn't in the chain of command for this, but I knew that the program was underway. But it wasn't until I read a very graphic cable about the waterboarding of an Al-Qaeda detainee named Abu Zubaydah that made me really shudder in revulsion in terms of the types of tactics that were used. And I had to think long and hard about it because this was the first time during my CIA career that I was aware of something, of a program that the CIA was involved in that was at odds with at least my moral compass. And so I spoke to some people about my concerns, including George Tenet. But at the same time, I recognized that it was a lawfully authorized program. And you can debate, and people, I think, are rightly critical of the Department of Justice memos that deemed it to be a lawful program. But at the time, that was the determination that was made. So over time, I was asked about this program. And I said that I was not a fan of it, but that I spoke out against it, but I didn't do so as forcefully as I would have liked. It has tailed me, and I think appropriately so, because I was a senior officer at CIA at the time. When Barack Obama asked me after he was elected president back in 2008 to be his CIA director, I was roundly denounced by my critics, especially those on the left, for my time at the agency during this program, and I withdrew my consideration for that position. And then in my confirmation hearing several years later, it came up again. So looking back on it now, I do believe I should have spoken out more forcefully about it, but I was really conflicted. I knew that the CIA was involved in very, very important work to save innocent lives, Americans and foreigners, in the aftermath of 9/11. They were doing some heroic work around the globe. And I knew that the detention interrogation program did not comport with my moral compass. And I do believe that it's important for institutions as a whole, or as an entity, as well as individual senior officials, to look at things that they are a part of. And of course, these programs need to be lawful. They need to be legally anchored and authorized. But to me, I think being lawful is a necessary but insufficient condition for some of these things. Many of the things that we see Donald Trump doing are lawful, but are they ethical? Are they principled? Are they moral? Are they consistent with American values? Are these the things that we want to be able to do because it's the right thing to do? And again, looking back on that detention interrogation program, I do think that some of those tactics that were employed should not have been. And so at that time, and in the book, I say it was my most egregious sin of omission during my career, not doing more in terms of speaking out. I vowed never to be silent again when there are things that I think are inconsistent with our values as a country. Now, it's easy with 2020 hindsight, especially now, almost 20 years after 9/11, for people to look back and to criticize the decisions that were made there. I feel fortunate that I was not in a position at the agency where I had to make a moral decision at the time regarding whether I was going to authorize other CIA officers to do this or do it myself. And the people who participated in that program, as long as within the four corners of what was authorized, they were carrying out their solemn responsibilities, which is why I refused to say that that program was torture. As long as people were carrying out the program consistent with the Department of Justice guidelines and presidential authorization. Those that engaged in some excesses, I do think that they violated their oath and their institutional and moral responsibilities. So it was a very important lesson for me. And after that, it made me think long and hard about some other things that I was involved in. And I wanted to make sure, again, that something was not just lawful, that it also had to be, if I was going to be involved in it, ethical, principled, moral, and consistent with American values.
Thanks very much, John. John, so in 2009, the Obama administration asked you to come join them as the assistant to the president for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. Now, this will be a 4-year run in which you dealt with a whole host of issues, to include H1N1 pandemic, the Deepwater Horizon, Hurricane Sandy and Irene, the underwear bomber, Umar Farouk Abdullah, and then, of course, the horrible tragedy at Sandy Hook, and then the mission to get bin Laden. So can you give us a sense of how President Obama handled all of these crises and these very unique moments in history, and which one kind of had the most effect or impact on you?
Well, one of the real fortunate things for me was that a week after President Obama was elected back in November 2008, I went to Chicago and had a extended sit-down conversation with him. And I really felt that we were very much in alignment as far as how we viewed right and wrong, government responsibilities, that North Star. And so I felt that this is a person that I really could work for, because I believe that our values, our ethics, our principles really are very, very closely aligned. And so throughout the course of those first 4 years, when I served as his advisor on these various issues, not only was I comfortable that we had the same approach on issues, and particularly the sanctity of human life, but also he was somebody who recognized that the United States has tremendous power and capability, but that it's also the responsibility of a government to exercise that power in the most judicious manner possible. And also, he was somebody who obviously has a very, very impressive intellect, but he recognized also that he needed to rely on the expertise and the guidance and the recommendations of others. And so whether you're talking about the H1N1, where we really relied on the medical experts and the scientists in terms of how to think about this evolving and dynamic H1N1 virus, or dealing with hurricanes and how we're going to try to address the needs of the peoples whose lives have been devastated by the weather, as well as a lot of the counterterrorism programs that we were involved in. Obviously, the bin Laden raid, and I devote a fairly lengthy chapter in the book to that, really was one of the seminal events, certainly in my professional career, and one that I'll always remember. But the ones that I think linger most and last with me, Bill, are the ones that we made mistakes, and that I made mistakes as far as trying to ensure that I had as much information as possible so that I could go up to President Obama in the Oval Office and say, this is what is being recommended, this is what I think, this is what I advise. And despite the greatest care and the greatest capabilities and precision of weapon systems, mistakes can be made, or things do not turn out as flawlessly as you want. And it's those times when I gave some guidance or made some recommendations that I look back on it now, and unfortunately, there were innocent lives that were killed. Now, during the course of the Obama administration was criticized for, the strikes that we took But I must say, the care, the precision, the rigor that went into those decisions was as strong as we could make it at the time. No, it wasn't perfect, and I assume responsibility for any shortcomings on that score. But again, when I think back during my career, there are a lot of things that I feel quite proud to be a part of, and being part of that effort that actually put the seals on the Bob compound. Yeah, that's going to last with me. But there's other instances where I still, lie awake at night sometimes and say, what could I have done differently or better? It's those lessons that I like to be able to say I then thought about during the remainder of my career, and that I think about today.
You're not confirmed to be you withdrew your nomination to be the director of CIA early on, but then in March of 2013, you become the 21st person to lead the CIA. And frankly, I think it was only one of 5 or 6 men who had previous CIA experience. A lot of them, other than that, were kind of political appointees. But soon after taking over, you began a modernization effort at the CIA, and something that I know that to this day has had a remarkable and positive impact on the agency. Can you talk about that modernization effort?
When I became CIA director, I had already spent 25 years earlier in the CIA, bouncing around in operations, analysis, management, staff. I had served rotations with the Department of State, was at the National Counterterrorism Center, PDB briefer. I thought, had a good sense of CIA strengths, weaknesses. And then when I was served at the White House with President Obama, I could see CIA from that White House perspective. And so when I became CIA director, I wanted to take advantage of my experience to position CIA to handle the challenges of the future, as opposed to rest on whatever laurels it had in its past. And I had always been impressed during the early parts of my career by efforts to better integrate capabilities in order to optimize the preferred outcomes and to make things more effective and efficient. Goldwater-Nichols is a great example in the 1980s, that the act of Congress that really reshaped the military so that you would bring together the services, the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and put them into integrated commands in a unified chain of command, so that we would have much better outputs and outcomes by that better integration. And I felt as though the CIA itself could benefit from having more integration in the agency. At the same time, the ecosystem, the global ecosystem that the CIA was operating in had changed fundamentally through the course of its 70-year career or whatever. And certainly during, since I joined the agency in 1980. And technology was revolutionizing our daily lives, but also revolutionizing the intelligence business. And so I really felt that the CIA needed to understand how best to operate in that changed ecosystem and be more flexible and adaptable and agile in that environment, which really required better integration. And so I commissioned a 90-day study group and brought some very senior people together to look at what we could do to better organize ourselves so that we would be much more effective in carrying out our mission. And that modernization effort led to then a reorganization. And so rather than individual directorates that would coordinate or collaborate across those directorate lines with one another, I thought about that Goldwater-Nichols model, as well as the National Counterterrorism Center model, where you bring operators and analysts and scientists and technologists and open source experts and cyber experts together so that they can better bring together their experiences, capabilities, and perspectives to address the either regional issues that CIA faces or those functional issues. And so we created at the time 10 mission centers, which are similar in nature to what the military has as far as Pacific Command or European Command, Special Operations Command. Again, either regional or functionally focused. So I certainly irritated a lot of people, and understandably, because people who grew up in CIA's culture, in the individual directorates, a lot of organizations are very uncomfortable with change. But although I am a very proud liberal arts major, both at Fordham as well as at UT. I am a real advocate and proponent of systems engineering. And I encourage students to be thinking about that, because in this great, big, wonderful world of ours, having the opportunity to try to organize and arrange one's approach to their professional responsibilities, you take into account not just structures and practices and authorities, but also training and capabilities. And how do you organize and architect that organization in this technologically driven world to be much more effective? And although a lot of my detractors said that they were going to, reverse the modernization effort once I left the agency, thankfully it has prevailed. I think it's been tweaked, which is absolutely correct. You're never going to get something right in the first time. And it also has to, I think, evolve in the future. People would ask me, when is this modernization process or program going to be over with? I said, it's never going to be over with, because it has to be a process of continuous improvement, because that ecosystem that the CIA and the rest of the world operates within will continue to morph and change. And the CIA continues to take that into account as it adapts again to the new realities.
So, John, as your career in the CIA is winding down, it's approaching the 2016 election, and the intelligence community uncovers a plot by the Russians to influence the U.S. election. Now, obviously, a lot has been said about the Russian hacking, but what do we need to say to kind of set the record straight? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there. And then secondly, kind of what lessons can we take away from that interference to protect the upcoming elections?
Well, I think any type of interference, there are two dimensions. One is the technical intrusion front. And that is, what can foreign actors or even domestic actors do to try to navigate into the electoral systems, whether they be the voter registration rolls or actual, tallying of votes or whatever. And I think a lot of work has been done over the last several years to try to make those systems less vulnerable. Now, voting is owned by the states. It's a state responsibility. So in the United States, the voting system is very distributed and diverse. So large-scale, systematic, technical intrusions, I think, are it's unlikely. However, I think we still need to make sure that they're not going to be those types of intrusions that could bring down those voter registration rolls or other types of things. The much more concerning, from my perspective, and much more insidious and damaging are those influence operations that, again, foreign actors or domestic actors engage in to try to push things into that digital environment and social media platforms in order to shape the views, the sentiments, and the votes of Americans. And the Russians are very, very sophisticated at that, pushing out personas that appear to be U.S. persons or U.S. organizations or entities, but they are Russian creations. And we saw that they did that very extensively in 2016 and are doing it again now. But other countries and states do that. Now, the Russians are very sophisticated in how they carry these things out. But this is a manner for them to be able to exploit that digital environment, just the way they exploited the physical environment in years past and continue to, with different types of newspaper articles that they might place in journals or wherever, or getting somebody who is working in the news network system to work on behalf of their interests and push out a certain narrative or misrepresent the facts. Or what we saw what the Russians did in 2016 was to steal emails and then push it out and release embarrassing information, maybe even adjusting some of the language in those emails. So I do think that it's important for us to understand that this digital environment, which is owned and operated 85% by the private sector, is really going to be, I think, the challenge for the next decade or more, how the government, our government and other governments, are going to work with the private sector, the internet service providers and others, to try to guard against, to the greatest extent possible, the exploitation of that environment in order to push out disinformation that really will mislead the American public and the American voter. That's really, really tough. And although I think some progress has been made when the Facebooks and Twitters of the world realize that some of these foreign actors are exploiting their platforms and they're trying to go through and comb that out, it is still a very, very imprecise art and science in terms of what it is they're doing. So I think the American people really need to realize that digital environment, that social media environment, is going to continue to be a venue for disinformation and misinformation, and they need to try their best to try to discern the truth in an environment where the information runs the gamut from truthful to the most specious.
So finally, as I said early on, I want to finish kind of at the beginning. You open the book with your last day in office and briefing the newly elected President Donald Trump. You clearly had misgivings at that time of your initial briefing with the president-elect, and that obviously hasn't changed over the last 4 years. So can you give us your assessment of the president as we approach November 3rd?
Well, I knew that when Donald Trump was elected president, that he didn't have the experience, he didn't have the temperament, he didn't have an understanding of our history and global events in order to be a good and competent president. I was hoping, though, that he would realize that he had now these solemn responsibilities and that he would do his utmost to approach the job with seriousness. Unfortunately, I don't think he has. And again, I can forgive the inexperience. I can forgive his lack of understanding of history. He is a product of his background. And I can even forgive the incompetence that results as a result of those things. But what I cannot forgive or forget is that he has been very dishonest, and he has lied to the American people, and he has continued to pursue policies, I think, that benefit him personally, politically, financially, whatever. And he does so at the detriment of the greater good of our country. And so Donald Trump has been, in my mind, the antithesis of what I believe a president should be, which is a president of all people in the United States who recognizes that he or she has this obligation to do what they can to better the Americans across the board, but also somebody who recognizes that the United States, I believe in American exceptionalism, not because we're better or stronger or smarter than anybody else, but because we've had this exceptional good fortune of this country that is just full of wonderful resources and capabilities and is the melting pot of this world. And he has failed to recognize that the United States has these very special and exceptional responsibilities on the global stage. And the fact that he is not speaking out for human rights, the fact that he's not speaking out for advancement of democratic principles, the fact that he continues to cater to authoritarian rulers around the globe, to me is a betrayal of what this country stands for and what we as Americans should strive for. And so therefore, I have only been more disappointed in Donald Trump over the last 4 years. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to turn a page and soon recover, I think, from what I believe has been serious damage to our national identity, but also to the unity of this country. The fact that this country is so divided and so split really just is going to undermine our ability to tackle some of the very important challenges that we have in the future, both at home as well as abroad.
Thanks very much to both of you. We appreciate your time and insights. Wish everybody a great day. Stay safe, and thanks very much to our guests for joining us today. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.